Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for Facility Management and Public-Private Partnerships, Then, Now, and Ahead. Please be aware that this webinar is being recorded and you are muted to prevent background noise during the presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them in the questions box. Our panel will be answering questions from the questions box throughout the presentation. If your question does not get answered during the presentation, then someone from the panel will reach out to you privately via email after the presentation to get your question answered. I now turn you over to one of our panelists for today, David Reynolds.
Welcome everyone on behalf of IFMA, the International Facility Management Association, and panelists and guests from WAPPP, the World Association of Public-Private Partnership Professionals, headquartered in Geneva. David Reynolds here to introduce the program and panelists. Thank you for your interest in public-private partnerships. P3, or interchangeably PPP, has become a strongly dynamic area with growing and diversifying social and economic impacts and professional opportunities. Today's session follows an event earlier this year by the Facility Management Consultants Council of IFMA, FMCC, for the webcast series Dancing with Change. FMCC President Kathleen Lausman joined WAPPP North America Chapter Chair David Baxter and colleague Sam Beydoun. What emerged from their discussion was a picture of growth and adaptations of P3s to fit an increasing range of project types, sizes, participants, and locations. In a short time, WAPP has developed clear, reusable methods for organizing, approving, financing, constructing, operating, and maintaining long-lived P3 projects. Facility management professionals, especially IFMA members, can bring experience and expertise to P3 projects throughout the life cycle. I'll introduce the panel. All the panelists participate at senior levels in deriving value from the built environment. Their linked profiles can be found on the registration page. Kathleen Lausman, IFMA FMCC President, is our host. Kathleen is a principal of Shift to Lean, specializing in performance consulting and training in Saskatchewan, Canada. David Baxter, co-host, is chair of the WAPPP North America Chapter. David consults globally in procurement and planning with public and private sector institutions, development banks, and agencies, focusing on P3s. He's based in Minnesota, the US. Gordon Rogers is president of the IFMA Public Sector Facilities Council, PSC, and a program director at Ketchell CEM. Ketchell is involved throughout the facility lifecycle in the public, institutional, and commercial sectors. Gordon is based in California, the US. Ben Gowdy is president of the IFMA Operations and Maintenance Health and Safety Community, OMHS. Ben is senior vice president at Controlled Contamination Services, specializing in data centers and critical environments. He's based in Texas, the US. Sam Beydoun is an independent P3 expert emphasizing value obtained relative to investment. He's active in WAPPP North America, and Sam brings a broad knowledge of transportation infrastructure programs and operations to P3 development and administration. He's based in the Washington, D.C. area in the U.S. David Dodd is president and CEO of International Sustainable Resilience Center and co-managing partner of Return on Resilience, Inc., a U.S.-based NGO affiliated technology company. He's co-chair of the WAPPP Sustainability and Resilience Chapter and has worked with IFMA previously. David's based in Louisiana in the U.S. Wayne Collins is a partner in GFMA Global Strategy Advisors, LLC. He's an active member of IFMA and WAPPP. He has more than 30 years of diverse facilities and asset management experience in both the public and private sectors. He's based in Ontario, Canada. I'm David Reynolds, a former FMCC president, active in IFMA and WAPPP, and a partner in GFMA Global Strategy Advisors. I'm based in Mississippi in the US. So over to you, Kathleen and David Baxter.
Thank you very much, David Reynolds. I just want to firstly welcome everybody. I'm very excited to moderate this conversation, and I know it's going to be of great interest, everyone. So we have a lot to talk about and only an hour to get it all in there. So I would like to start with, well, firstly, I just want to remind everybody we've just had an election. I am now the immediate past president of FMCC. So we're together there, David. All
What I meant
right.
is president.
Yes, yes, for sure. Very exciting. So, firstly, let's have a description of what P3 projects are for our audience and where the usual focus for P3s exist. So, what type of project? I'm gonna scoot this right over to David Baxter and then probably ask a couple of others to weigh in on that.
So P3s or public-private partnerships, as the name explains, are a partnership between the public and the private sector to deliver a service or infrastructure facilities of a sort. The process was introduced basically in the UK about 20 plus years ago, well, 25 years ago or more. And it was introduced as a mechanism or a way for governments to be able to build necessary infrastructure or provide necessary services in innovative partnerships with the private sector because of funding gaps that they were experiencing. So, in a public private partnership, there are typically different steps that are involved. You might see the acronym DBFOM, which refers to design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. But all models are variations of that. One or two of those elements could be missing. So, you could get a what you call a BOT or etc. But the critical element is that the private sector, as an innovative partner, is brought in to look at the phases of the project, which are typically more than that under an EPC project. And that's including the EPC elements, but also the operation and maintenance side, and also to be a source of financing. And in this process, risks are identified and shared accordingly and appropriately with different parties throughout the life cycle of the project. And that's just the general term, but there are many other descriptions that are similar, had little extra pieces or missing pieces to what I've said. But the focus is partnerships long term to deliver infrastructural services between the public and the private sector.
Excellent. Thanks, David.
David,
Anyone?
can I ask a question, Kathleen, of David
Sure.
on that definition? So for those of us who maybe haven't done a lot of these, what is the structure of the private side in this partnership? So I know there's a word that I've heard used, concessionaire, and then there are vendors. Can you explain that structure and what that looks like?
Yeah, so typically the public sector will create a partnership with the private sector through what is generally referred to as an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, or other people just refer to as a project company. And this is a legal entity that is set up specifically for the project. It should not be tied to an existing company because there are risks, that you would transfer risks of a company to the project when the project has to be a standalone legal entity, or the project company has to be a standalone legal entity. And so generally, it's a company that's formed once the award is made. It's a consortium that bids, but the company has to be established for the operation and maintenance, well, the design, build, operations, maintenance, etc. And then this company, the SPV, could have different parts to it. Some would be the investors, debtors, who after they've been paid off and got their share, they'll move on. You'll also get the construction side of the company, which is responsible for the design build elements. They often move on once that phase of the project is finished. But then, as you said, the concessionaire, if it's a term that people are more comfortable with, which is responsible for the operation and maintenance of the project throughout its lifetime. So it's a specific company formed for the event. I like just calling it the project company, with different partners, with like a revolving door process that go in and out during the different phases. And they're the ones who sign the agreement with with the public sector.
Excellent. So, can you or can someone speak to the typical life cycle of a P3? Or is there a typical life cycle?
I'll talk about that a little bit. So, from my past experience, the way that life cycle of a project starts, it has different phases. It starts with the conceptual um, uh, design and purpose and need for the project, where the public entity identifies a project and say this is what the intended goals and objectives of the projects are. Then it goes through a high level screening phase, if you will, where it assesses what the project characteristics are, what are the enabling legislation for the project. Is there an opportunity to generate revenues and funding for the project? Would there be a beneficial interest from the public entity and partner with the private sector by a way of shifting the risk, not completely shifting the risk, but allocating the risk to the private sector partner. And it goes through an evolution into a more defined due diligence for the project. And the reason I want to mention that because throughout the process in the development, there's always consideration for the long-term operation and maintenance for the project. Because P3s are performance-based contracts, we have to take those elements, performance into the design, that this construction, the financing, all the way throughout the life cycle of the project. So a determination will be made for the project technical feasibility and also the financial feasibility. And the financial feasibility analysis mostly depends on the value of partnering with the private sector. What value does the private sector bring in terms of design, construction, and long-term operation to the project? And if there's a value in that, partnering with the private sector, then the public entity will make a decision or comparison between the public delivery option and the private sector delivery option. And there is a value that proceeds to the procurement, if you will. And they go through the procurement process, and it's an involved process. It could take, it could be one step, two-step process for qualification, then selection or shortlisting, then negotiation, and get into the commercial agreement, and once that's awarded, then you look at the financial close. In other words, now it's time to arrange for the financing. How are we going to pay for this project? Then it goes into implementation for the design, construction, then operation maintenance. Operation maintenance focuses on the biggest portion of the project in the long term. Okay, but there the operation maintenance performance requirements gets early into the design of the project. So the maintainers and operators, it will be beneficial to the project to get them early on in the project to start the discussion and see where and developing the concept of the project and see where the innovations are and where the value being created.
Oh, that's
And
really
of
good.
course, yeah, and of course, after the operation maintenance period at the term, the end of the term, the contract, and typically in the U.S., the project will revert to the public owner, okay, because it was a concession over a period of time. So there could be in there elements, and there should be elements in that case. There performance standards for turning over that project. What conditions going to be in when you turn it over? So that process starts probably not right at the, let's say, year 30 out of 30-year term contract, but it starts more like 25 or 5 years prior to that to look at what assess the conditions, is it meeting the requirements, what needs to be done, so the public owner can get the project in according to the terms and conditions that they set out or specify in the P3 agreement.
Excellent. So this leads me to start thinking about projects being a cycle for sure. P3s are a lengthy cycle. What efforts are undertaken typically, and I know this will vary by project, but to actually capture requirements right from the get-go and is there room within the context of a P3, because it's a long time, a long term, is there ways to actually adapt to changing requirements? 30 years is a long time frame, so can anyone answer that one?
Well, I'll take a stab from my perspective, Kathleen, because I'm all about resilience and adaptation not only to climate but to other circumstances that can arise. And I'm working with the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, leading a development of guidance for integration of resilience into infrastructure and facilities. And the life cycle approach is really the way to look at this. What are the possible hazards that could arise over the life cycle of that 30-year time frame? And when you look at it from that perspective, you realize pretty quickly that there need to be measures taken on the onset from when the design of the facility starts all the way through completion and operation of these potential hazards. And there's a tremendous amount of data now available on different climate related risks. And there's also obviously a lot of information about other risks. And all of that has to be taken into account if you want a successful long term project.
Oh, that's such good advice. I was actually going to tap Gordon. It looks like the train has gone through a tunnel here, but one of the things that I think also needs to be addressed, absolutely, looking at resilience, but user requirements tend to change, particularly over a 30-year time frame. And I'm thinking right now more specifically about hospitals and university requirements, so on. There are just changing technology in the delivery of service in whatever um, you're involved with. So certainly technology in healthcare is huge, and that keeps changing. Diagnostics change and so on. So Gordon, is this something, or Ben, that you can speak to as the facility management folks that need to contend with these kinds of changes on a continuing basis?
Yeah, if you just
I'll
think
let
of the
you
last
go
few
first.
years. Oh, go ahead, Ben. Go ahead.
No, I was going to let you go first while you're not in a tunnel or anything. So go ahead.
Actually, I'm at a stop, but there's going to be a bunch of announcements, so go ahead.
Okay, I was just going to weigh in on both David and Sam's notes. First of all, involvement of a facility management professional early on, both through design um, and through the operation, is important to make sure that the requirements are captured and that the assets are maintained effectively and efficiently. I would also say that the resilience being built into the agreement at the beginning is critical, because we all know that once you document something on paper, sometimes it's difficult to you kind of lock yourself into time. And what you need is a change control process to ensure that you maintain with current times and future technology that's developed. So you build it into the process early on up front to ensure that that's something that you can address as it comes along.
Yeah, and
Excellent.
I would echo that. I think if you look at all of the changes that even occurred in the last 5 years in our world with COVID and hybrid work, people moving out of buildings and those sorts of things, it's really, we have some PPP projects in the court system in California that, you know, a bunch of people went home. And so now they have a bunch of empty office space that they'd sure like to convert into courtrooms because they're short of court space. And so how do you negotiate that if there aren't those proper protections um, in the contract?
David?
Yeah, I just wanted to, in support of that, say it is critical that in PPPs that a project management plan is drafted during the negotiations on the contract. that really defines, the operation and maintenance requirements, conditions, terms, however you wish to describe it, and that this is scheduled regularly. It should be a requirement, not as needs, but definitely on a fixed scale. And then also, it's really important that the concessionaire be held accountable for these actions. I mean, it's just so many times I've walked into project offices and asked to see the project management plan or the schedule, whatever, and they don't even know where it is or who's responsible for it.
Oh, that's such good advice. Sam, do you have something to add to that?
Yes, and I want to bring it down to practical perspective in regards to technology, how that is addressed in the P3s. I'll talk from experience and give an example in transportation. Some of the projects I was involved in is what we call the managed lane tolling system. Of course, that depends a lot on technology, and technology will change over the 30-year, 40-year period, whatever the concession period is. So if you think of the old tolling system, where they had manual collection, where you have a toll booth and cars would have to go through and pay. Now we have something that's called, tollless. I mean, not tollless. Electronic collection system where it's operated by cameras and sensors and things like that. So when we put out a solicitation and ask for the performance requirements, what we expect in that process is probably several iteration of refresh and taking into consideration obsolescence and using the latest technology. So the we would expect the bidders to provide details on how they can address that, and we make a judgment and value based on whatever they propose. So yes, we do expect refresh in technology. We do expect certain number of cycles of refresh and increase in technology. Keep in mind the end goal is to maintain the performance of the transportation system at certain speed, maintaining certain level of, um, uh, at, knowing exactly what the reliability of the trip time is going to look like. Okay. This is in transportation sector, but also I understand that in the hospital system there could be also changes in technology over time. So that is something from the risk perspective. The public entity will have to evaluate who is more capable to take on that risk, technology obsolescence and refresh. Okay. Is the public sector more capable of doing that? And if they are, that's great. Is there a value in that? Or are they going to price it because they're not able to take on that risk? They price it so high that the public entity will say, okay, maybe I can manage that risk better and take on that risk by doing the technology upgrade and all that ourselves. So those are some of the consideration for technology. So we have seen and some project where we shift the technology risk to the private sector, and we have seen where the public sector retain that risk because they think they can manage it better, and they can get better pricing on that and be able to provide you know updated services. So it's all about the technology. I mean the risk for technology and who's going to manage that risk better.
So that's really good input. We know that technology changes rapidly, and we know that the circumstances around how business is conducted also changes. So that almost suggests a fairly continuous liaison between the P3 delivery folks and the client, whoever the client might be. So, what's your experience with that? Perhaps Wayne, you can weigh in on that.
Yeah, no, and thank you. And just the previous panels expressed about the importance of the operational elements, and how that affects the long term. Certainly being involved on the design and good governance, so that everything's in the document.
because you have to manage with that long-term contract and just some of the challenges we've discussed regarding changes in technology. So it's really being attuned to that, number one, what's in the actual agreement, the project agreement you're working with, because that can create problems if it's not a well-structured agreement, irrespective of what type of P3 it is or infrastructure. You still have to manage this asset and do it well. And there's penalties for those that are not, if that's what's in the agreement is not being delivered. So it's the relationship developed certainly as far as a well-designed P3 from the operational elements that you're going to have to live by, and certainly ongoing, so that you're sort of ahead of those any challenges that come up, and obviously changes in technology. I mean, one way of mitigating that ideally is by doing it by outcomes. So you're giving certain metrics that are for the what has to be delivered, but yet it gives you the owner, or certainly the maintainer in this case, the flexibility to how you go about doing that. So changes in technology, you can reap the rewards and benefits. Of course, there's the risk element of having that in that role, but certainly strong alliances and relationships. Communication is key to sort of eliminate any problems that sort of could fester over time, misunderstandings or whatever it might be. So you have a good, strong working relationship with what's been delivered and how it's being delivered. And like I said, the operations and maintenance is of vital importance. That's going to affect the long-term asset value and certainly ultimate deliverables. So yeah, that's of key importance.
Excellent input. Gordon is still trying to get back on the train here. So Ben, I'm going to ask this question to you. This speaks to, just based on what needs to happen here, the document itself, the whole project, ensuring that it covers every aspect. But it sounds like it's really important to have continuous liaison throughout the course of a project with the owner and with the delivery folks. So how do you suggest that actually take place?
My experience in the past has been with what's called at least what we call the change control board. And what you do is you identify the membership of that panel or that board early on as part of the project documentation up front. You require a meeting frequency, and then you measure the KPIs of the performance that Wayne just outlined. You manage against those KPIs. You see how your project is performing against that. You identify new innovations in technology, etc. You review those in detail. You then build those into the plan, and you come to an agreement on how you're going to move forward to meet that.
So that would theoretically allow a continuous evaluation of the whole performance of a P3 as well.
Yeah, that's why I think it's important to set your performance KPIs up front with your minimum thresholds and your standards. Again, as I mentioned earlier, once you document something at a particular level today, that might not apply 30 years from now. So you need to have the ability to manage how the change in technology, innovation, performance over time, so that you don't lock yourself into something from 30 years ago that you can do in half the time or half the cost or whatever in the future.
Oh, that's such good advice.
Yeah.
This notion of continually reviewing things, I think, is really, really critical.
Kathleen, I can just add to that. I think if anybody's ever procured a project by using the design build delivery method, you realize how much work it's important to put the time in at the beginning of the project. P3s are the same way, except there's even more to think about now, because now you're thinking about the life cycle of the building. So don't underestimate the amount of time investment that's required to get this contract right, get your service level agreements correct. One of the gotchas that I've seen occur is just cost escalation and maintenance. So the life cycle cost analysis is maybe underestimated, and so as those costs increase, then those costs end up getting paid by the public entity that's under contract. So that could really strain budgets and things. that you just have to put the time in advance, do your best to get the information, because once that contract is signed, it's a 30-year deal.
Well, geez, you've really you've touched on something. I'm going to put this question out to everyone because we're experiencing this change in the marketplace, supply chains, and everything so dramatically, and I'm not certain that that's possible to anticipate that, but particularly for a long time frame. So, the cost of materials, the suppliers of services, and so on change over time. So, how would you suggest recognizing that that may be a situation that's a risk situation within a P3 structure? How would you suggest, and you may not even have an answer on this, but to anticipate this potential gyration and how to adjust and manage that? So I mean, it's the provider as well as the owner.
Can I say something? Uh,
Sure.
so, we need to remember that PPP projects are dynamic and they have
Yes.
a very, very long lifeline. So there are very, very few clairvoyants, if you can put it that way, who can really predict what a project's going to be like in 10 years' time, 20 years' time, 30 years' time. And so because of that, it is critically important that you don't get tied into what you call it, a legal document drafted by lawyers that is inflexible and, insists that if you have to adapt your approach, make changes to accommodate, as David would say, adverse climate events, um, market changes, demand, materials, etc. If you don't have that flexibility to adjust it, the project could fail because it's held to such rigid conditions that it becomes impractical and unmanageable. So I think one of the things that needs to be done is there need to be, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, but some sort of escape clauses that are put in, which could result in the project management team and the public sector and the private sector leaders agreeing to find a way to make adjustments throughout the lifetime because just things change.
Well, that's such a good segue into answering a question that popped up actually from a procurement lawyer. So the question is, what are typical factors considered when selecting private partners? In other words, the at the RFQ stage. David Dodd, did you want to attempt that one?
No, I had my hand up while David was speaking, but certainly, certainly that's probably the most important decision in developing a P3 is that private partner and what they bring to the table, other than just money. David Baxter, I love to quote David because he says such great things. He said, if we look at the private partner just as a financier, we're missing the boat. They have to be much more than a financier. They have to bring more to the table than money if you want a really productive P3. And picking up on what David said, the things that could go wrong are increasing exponentially with climate change. Not only that, but all of the political and geopolitical turmoil that's happening. And one of the things that has resulted from this, increasingly spiking demand for covering those risks is the advent of insurance-linked securities such as catastrophe bonds.
All right.
They're called parametric because they're based on certain parameters. The facility management sector needs to become very aware of those, and there have been catastrophe bonds linked to cities that were participated in by facilities, and those they take a pro rata share of the premium, and they take a pro rata share when that pays. The beauty of that is it pays generally within 7 to 10 days after the event. Whereas federal assistance in the U.S. and in many other places takes months, if not years. So that's something for facility managers to consider,
Hmm.
in the outset of a project, and when it's when it's nearing completion, would it be worth their while to team up with the cities or that they're in, or with other facilities, to look at these types of securities that are now being traded on the secondary market. And there's billions and billions of dollars of these being issued every year, and it's growing exponentially. So that's my 2 cents.
I
Oh,
could
that's
just
such
add,
good
if I could just
advice.
add one thing there, asking what type of partners you look for, it's often stated that we want partners who are innovative. And that is a great thing, but a risk as well. And, so when I advise when people are looking for innovative partners, they also need to be able to prove their innovation experience, how they thought out of the box, the approach that they did, and also, understanding local context, because if they are so innovative that no one knows what they're talking about, no one knows how to implement it, the project's going to be a disaster. And I absolutely advise governments when they put out procurements, please avoid putting in the term state of the art uh, approach. Because what the heck does state of the art mean?
Oh, that's good advice. Yeah. The art keeps changing anyway.
Yeah.
As well.
That's because there's a big difference between bleeding edge and cutting edge.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. You know what? I think that we should touch on some history as well. I think we discussed a bit of this the last time we chatted, but P3 projects have gone south for various reasons, and I don't know if there's a particular way based on the experience thus far, whether there's a good way to guard against that or to you know deal with that potential risk, but it's real. So I could you folks sort of suggest how to actually plan and guard against, I don't know if you can even guard against it, but how you can actually look into that risk potential. So Wayne, I'm going to ask you because to kick it off, there have been some P3 projects in Canada that went south for,
Yeah.
and most of them involved one of the same providers. So, uh, do you have any advice to offer around that?
Well, being careful with obviously commentary and details in that regard. I mean, it's publicly well-known information, but it really comes down to poor governance. I mean, some of the old agreements, you're going back a few years, where they weren't well structured. They were put together at the day to, the political euphoria to sort of announce this project, and obviously years later, there's a lot of lessons learned. As far as how things could have been structured better, and obviously, it is in the agreement essentially, because that's what the lawyers are going to look at. What is actually in writing? Is it you're going to fight over a misunderstanding about something and who's going to pay for it? It comes down to the legal ramifications. So it really has to be good governance and good agreements to begin with, that are well-structured deals. And as David Baxter definitely astutely pointed out, is pick the right partners. It's not just here's the money. It's here's the long-term, someone who's in it to win it, but also in it to sort of make sure that's a viable project long term. They're going to be in it. They're not just in it for a short time frame, and you want it to be successful for everybody. So I mean, what's already in place, I mean, you can mitigate that. Sometimes there's mechanisms in projects to how you would deal with that and resolve those issues for resolution. Ideally, it's a shorter list, and it should be duly noted, so there's not unrealistic expectations, especially in certainly in the last 5 years. If you look at the number of so-called 100-year events that keep reoccurring. Nobody has a crystal ball and can predict, exactly how it's going to be. And if they were to sort of even agree to that, the problem with that too is that risk is built in, embedded, and costed into the project. So you end up paying a lot more for something that's amortized over, say, 30 years. Essentially because there's so much risk in there, they have to build in this extra money. So it's not as competitive. Whereas if you sort of look at the core elements of, on the operational sense of what it's going to cost, and you can have reasonable projections and isolate that from some of the other special events and have those as exclusions that are noted in the project agreement that, you kind of share. Maybe it's a pain share, share the risk as well as the rewards for certain excluded components that would be related to weather events or something that are really beyond control. So just communication with the right parties and good governance is what it comes down to.
Thanks, Wade. David, do you have something to add to
Uh,
this?
I've often found, why projects fail is often there's political or stakeholder pressure to appoint a partner no matter what. And
Hmm.
one should be in the situation that if the procurement fails, you should be able to start it again, not be forced to make a choice of the lesser of the two, three, or four evils that there are. This is one thing that often destroys projects. But I think some of the things that also can be improved from the public sector side when they are procuring projects is to ensure that the objectives are very clear and well defined and the desired outcomes and deliverables. Because if those are not put in place, then it's a free for all and no one really knows what the project's supposed to be doing and where it's supposed to be going to. The other thing is there's always a big question of who's going to pay for the feasibility study. We don't have the money, we don't have the resources. A poor feasibility study or a non-existent feasibility study is a recipe for disaster. The other is, and one of the previous speakers mentioned, is the political announcements and all that. So many countries that I've worked in, the PPP unit has come to me in a panic and says that our ministers announced we are going to launch a PPP in 3 months' time. We've done no planning, we have no understanding of the project, etc. So truncated procurement processes or timelines result in steps being skipped, bad decisions being made, and then you land up not choosing viable partners. So, the blame often lies on both sides. It's easy to blame the private sector for the failure, but it's also the public sector. And Sam will know this, and I, followed it closely. The Purple Line project in Maryland is a litany of things that you should not do when you are procuring a PPP project, monitoring it, etc. And if you've never heard of that project, just type in Purple Line PPP, and there will be a plethora of lessons on what not to do when you procure a project like that.
Sam, anything to add?
Yeah, well, what are the key success factors of P3? How to avoid failures? Okay, I think it starts with the public entity and it ends with the public entity to ensure that the project is successful. By that I mean early on in the project, like David Baxter said, be clear about your goals and objectives. What are your expectations from the project? And make that very well known to the private sector during the procurement process, especially during the qualification process. Because when you invite the private sector to bid on the project, you're asking them to provide their qualifications for success, and you set up your selection criteria based on predictability of success, on their past experience, what they have done, and whether they were successful or not. And once you do that, you're selecting the right partner, but also you have to be during negotiation, you have to be realistic in your expectations. Okay, in other words, take on that risk that you are capable of taking on, and don't shift the risk to the private sector that the private sector cannot manage properly.
Hmm.
Okay, so understand your expectations from the project. Once you do that, then the contract itself becomes nothing but a tool to memorialize all these agreements and the intent, the good faith effort, the best effort, and all of that, with the understanding that things will change. But one thing I'd like to touch on, ongoing during the project life cycle, is the governance piece and the reporting mechanism. Because when you start with the value for money analysis and you make a determination to deliver this project as a P3, you're not looking at just the construction period. You are looking for the whole life cycle, the value that's being provided over the life cycle. Now, if you don't monitor the performance year on year or periodically, whatever the case may be, how would you know you continue to receive that value without monitoring? So that's a question that we have to ask ourselves. The other piece of that that's really good news and why we should have those reporting mechanisms is if there are any problems with the project, you can detect those early on and you take corrective actions as to avoid failure. Because I always say there is no such thing as private sector failed or public sector failed. It's the whole PPP project that fails.
Yeah. And if I
Oh,
could
that's
just tag on what Sam
yeah.
is saying there, is so many times I've heard, there's a great celebration when the announcement is made that the award is done, everyone celebrates. They forget that that's when the real hard work starts. The stuff up front actually might have been the easiest part. And I've also heard, so many times that the public sector is amazed that they actually should also appoint a contract manager who's monitoring the project, ensuring that things are being met. You don't just sign, say, okay, great, talk to you in 30 years' time when the project is done, and then everyone holds their fingers crossed, to hope that things did go well because it won't.
Ben, please add your thoughts into this.
Yeah, I would just reiterate exactly what everyone said, and that is, from a facility management perspective, which is more my area, early engagement, early in the project. So often I've seen critical maintenance items value engineered out of projects that then end up causing a problem down the road. Get that involvement early, participate in the governance structure, as everyone's alluded to, because like everyone said, 30 years is a long time, and we hope to still get along with everybody at the end. So
And
Actually, if
maybe
you
And maybe what you call it, succession planning is also important
yes,
because if you hire
yeah,
project managers of our age, and I hope I'm not insulting anyone, we're not going to be around when that project is still on the go in 20 or 30 years' time. I mean, hopefully we just happily retired and fishing, but not on another place. But that is, a reality. Yeah.
that's such a good point. I'm glad you surfaced that because 30 years is a career or longer than a career. So it's really important to take into account on both public and private succession planning and how do you keep folks in tune with the project itself. So uh, please speak to that, Gordon. Well, he might have been out of the conversation for a bit
I
there.
think he's on mute. I think his mic's muted. That's what it looks
Oh,
like.
yes, Gordon is muted.
I'll just weigh in really quick on that,
Sure.
because I think David Baxter has brought up an excellent point. Succession planning, both to manage the succession itself, but also the transfer of knowledge from person to person or entity to entity, standard pass downs and all that. But I think that's succession planning, having, a primary and an alternate, and always having that backup person that's going to carry the torch forward, at least somewhat up to speed, as you move along, as you get to those transition points.
Yeah,
That's
one of the
great advice.
things, and I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, one of the things that we talk about succession planning. Really, that in my experience, it's called project management. And when we talk about project management, we're talking about the whole life cycle of the project, which includes not just the succession planning for the people who are coming that into the project that they don't have any idea where it started or how was those terms negotiated and all that. There's something that we have developed in the past that's called project management system that captures all of those details on if we made a decision on to assign that risk to this entity, why was the reason for that, and document that. and capture that in the knowledge management system that will be included part of to the project management. The other thing about project management is if you are planning on measuring the success, if you will, over the life cycle of the project. That would be built into the project management system. How often do we review progress review? How often do we review reports or require those reports? And what happens if something goes wrong? What is the escalation mechanism for dispute negotiation or dispute resolution, things like that? All of that has to be part of that project management system that is developed and agreed upon early in the project development and signed off during the contract as part of the contract or the project agreement. So it should be no surprise, a few years down the road that or something comes up and we don't know how to handle it. That should be all contemplated in the project ahead of time and trying to place a mechanism in terms of governance, if you will, on how to resolve those issues. Keeping in mind that the end result, we want the project to succeed, right? We want this project to see till the end of its term. By the way, 30 years we're using that as an example. It's not the standard. Okay, each project will vary and differ for that. So
Right.
I've seen project as early on in the P3s in the US. I've seen project as project term as long as 75 years. Well, that's a long time. If we talk about 30 years, a long time. 75 years ages, in comparison. But luckily, we don't do that anymore. What we do, the standard, is trying to match the project utility life cycle with the financing of the project. So those terms has changed a lot, realizing that it's a long term to trying to manage all these things. And of course, when you try to predict something in the future and long term future, you don't have a good handle on what the cost is. You just start plugging in some numbers that will escalate the project cost. That's not a good practice.
Right.
I
So
have
true.
a wonderful anecdotal story that I could share very briefly. In a
Sure.
previous consulting life, I worked for a company that was tasked with doing a review of a PPP power project in Latin America. And the story was interesting, and it could have been disastrous, but luckily it wasn't. The public utility hired a new young engineer who was asked to review the contract terms, etc., of this power station that was operating for many years. And he came back after a week to his managers and said, "Do you know that the contract expired 5 years ago?" And the situation was that because the project was running well, it was delivering revenue, it wasn't in any distress, etc., and that no one bothered to even check, on it, and that created a quandary. So, young folks, when you bring them in, might discover things that us older folks have become jaded to. And I thought I'd share that story with you, and it's actually a true story.
Wow, that's great. So we're almost at the end of our session here, but there's such good advice here, and I like the examples of experience. So is there maybe there is, and maybe this is an opportunity, but is there a guidance manual for how to set up P3s for success that is based on all of this previous experience and learning?
I don't normally promote other people's books or things, but I don't know if you can see it. But this book, which I is
Great.
almost my Bible,
Okay.
and it's readily available. It's an extensive study that was done of multiple countries, etc. And so, if you do want to buy something, it's very succinct, down to the point, and I'll change the side. You can see it's nice and thin. It's not a 200-page document that you will never read.
Oh, that's great. As we both have large libraries, you can see that I'm very interested in that one myself for sure. So we will definitely put that title up for reference for audience and anyone else who might be interested. So does anyone else have some advice? And I'm interested too for input from the owner, the facility manager. So Gordon or Ben, if you have some advice as well on what you've learned over time with these that has now become a standard in your practice.
I think for me, it's the third word in the PPP. It's partnership, and I think if you can approach this relationship as a public entity instead of in an adversarial way, looking for opportunities to, charge various things for delays and whatever. If you can look at it as a true partnership, share the risk. Most of these partners that are doing this type of work have your best interest in mind. They're not in business to do things for free, so you have to go into the relationship knowing that. But at the same time, you can rely on them a lot of times to help when things are going difficult or going south, and they want to make the project successful. That's my experience. Is they want to make the project successful. They want to make it work for you. So uh, you know, use them as a true partner instead of um, looking at them as an adversary or.
I like that advice. Ben?
Yeah, I would just add to what Gordon said, and that follow, define your process for governance, build the flexibility into that through the process. The process can be flexible, can facilitate flexibility and resiliency, um, but in the end, that helps contribute to the partnership.
Thank you. David?
I'd just like to add, I think it's important, that when we focus on the word partnership, it's almost like a marriage. It needs to work well. And therefore, it's important that collaborative and non-punitive arrangements are put in place so that if something goes wrong, there is not a punitive reaction by the public sector against the private sector, but a reaction that results unanimously, let's fix it and let's make it, let's secure the success of the project. Because when you marry the private sector and the public sector together in a relationship, it's different cultures, different approaches, different perceptions, different values. You can go down the list. These all have to be morphed somehow into a working relationship that is based on trust.
Oh, such
The,
great.
the, the one thing I would ask or point to that we would ask from the private sector is be realistic in your approach to risk. In other words, don't take on unnecessary risks just to win the work. Oftentimes that results in, and I've seen it happen in many examples, it results in disaster that nobody will benefit from it, not the public sector or private sector. So it is very important to be honest with ourselves when we get into these agreement or start looking at it. Can we successfully manage the project and get our required return on investment from this? You know, and don't be shy about telling, your principals, whatever it is, say, this is too risky. If we price it this way, we have to cut corners and the project will not succeed. And we have seen that in on the public side in a project where an entity gets into these projects just to get their foot in the door, especially if they're coming from overseas. They want to establish a foothold here in the U.S. or North America, and take on unnecessary risk, thinking that we'll use this project as a loss leader, but we'll make it up somewhere else. That in my mind, that strategy, and I've seen it backfire in many projects.
Yes, that's true. That's such good advice. Like, just don't set yourself up for failure. So, well, we are down to the last seconds of our hour here. So I really want to thank all of you. This is such a great discussion, such a good sharing of information. And I think that we may have to do another one. Thank you very much, folks. So just for our audience, there is going to be this whole session will be available online, so you can check it out. And our contact information is also going to be posted. So if you want to dig into other questions, feel free, because that's what this group is here for, is to give you excellent advice and information. So thanks very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you everybody for
Thank you.
coming. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees. Right now on the screen, I have everybody's lovely headshot, all of their credentials, where they work, everything like that. And if you want to talk to one of them more and you want more answers on P3s or anything in the facility management world, procurement world, these are the big brains here. So please respond to the email that you got your registration link from, or the email that you're going to get tomorrow with the recording. Respond, let me know who you want to get into contact with, and I will get you into contact with one of our amazing panelists. So thank you so much, everybody, for today.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.
Thank you.
Have a great day. Thanks.
Bye.